I imagine that all of us collectors are probably about the same. We buy more than we watch. Going out in stores, finding something hard to find, or great deals that end up leading to a massive pile of stuff, and a watch list that always seems to be growing. So I've challenged myself to watch 31 films in 31 days of the stuff I haven't watched yet in the collection. And what better way to start this series than with the antithesis, hard word for me to say, of buying to watch than Snow Girl and the Dark Crystal. I knew jumping into this challenge this had to be the first on the list. Years ago I bought Snow Girl when it first came out with the hopes it'd be a fun fantasy flick, but what I got was a Blues Cruise Festival instead. If you bought Snow Girl within the first week or so at Walmart, there was a printing error, and instead of getting the film, you got some random Blues Cruise Festival instead. I ended up emailing Wellgo USA, and they had me return the disc and sent me a new one, and after checking to make sure the disc would load the right film, I put it back in the case, back on the shelf, and after several moves later, finally time to watch this one. Snow Girl and the Dark Crystal follows Song Q, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize, as he steals the Dark Crystal from Hell. The crystal can shift the powers between the three realms of heaven, hell, and earth, so Devilman Crybaby sends out his legion of demons to win the crystal back. First off, yes, the CGI is terrible, but I do like a lot of the designs they have for the creatures in the film, and honestly I was really having a lot of fun with the film for about the first hour. Decent action set pieces, fun monsters, decent story setup, but when the film finally reveals itself to what is actually happening in this really soft plot twist, the film just fell apart for me. The first hour just blew past me, but that last hour was a slog. It turns down this road that's so cliched and frankly uninteresting with a forced, underdeveloped love plot that it just becomes really boring compared to the first hour. I do love the hard fantasy that this film is trying to live in, even though the CGI, makeup, hair, and wardrobe are all pretty bad. It weirdly comes together to fuel the fantasy epicness it's trying to achieve. Most of the score and cinematography is nothing to run home to mother about, but it's not distracting or bad either. It's just very serviceable. And honestly, some of the humor landed for me. It's not very often that the humor is in the film, and sometimes it can be kind of cheesy humor, but it did make me chuckle a few times. Snow Girl definitely has some good things going for it, but unfortunately it falls apart and it never really gets its foot back. Riders of Justice have some of the lamest box art ever. Nobody is ever on motorcycles, and it presents a movie that is not what Riders of Justice is. Riders is a much more character-driven drama revenge tale that has explosive moments of action rather than a full-throttle action ride. Directed by Anders Thomas Jensen and stars Mads Mikkelsen as Marcus, a military man who returns home after a subway incident kills his wife. His daughter was also on the train, so him and her both have to figure out how to deal with their loss. Both of them deal with it in very different ways. His daughter, played by Andrea Kid-Gatterberg, if I'm pronouncing that wrong I apologize, is trying to process the events leading up to the accident and trying to understand how those events led to the accident, while Marcus is emotionally void and burying his feelings, making him cold, distant, and hot-tempered. One night a man named Otto and Linhart show up at Marcus's house as they believe the train accident was no accident. Otto was on the train as well, and he actually gave up his seat for Marcus's wife to sit down, and he's trying to process this traumatic experience since he feels deeply guilty for insisting that Marcus' wife takes his seat. She would have probably survived otherwise. They enlist the help of Enthalmer after they believe a large biker gang was involved to silence the witness that was on the train. This is one of those movies that balances a lot of tones really well. You get the dark, dramatic moments that really grip you in. There's scenes in this film that I will always remember because of the amazing performances that this cast gives. And while the comedy moments are few and far between, they land as genuinely funny without being corny. And finally, the heart-pounding action set pieces are thrilling, pack a punch, and very satisfying. My biggest issue really comes down to mainly the sound effects. I can't tell if it was a compression issue or just bad sound design, but there's a few moments where it's pretty distracting. Otherwise, it's a pretty outstanding film. Honestly, the performances here are some of the best I've seen for a 2021 film and is the real driving force of the film. Visually, the film is pretty solid. It has some great lighting, it has some great coloring to help complement the tone. This was one I went in mainly wanting to see because of Mads, but fell in love with the cast and their performances, and I can't recommend this one enough. Eighth Grade is the feature directorial debut of Bo Burnham, and it's a strong personal debut. The film follows Kayla, played by Elsie Fisher, as a socially awkward girl leaving the 8th grade and moving into high school. She's someone who wants to be more confident and understands how to be, but doesn't know how to use this knowledge to fit in. She works on herself or her self-image by doing YouTube vlog videos and trying to implement her own advice into everyday life, which rarely works for her. Let me say this. This is a very cringe-inducing film. Honestly, one of the most genuinely cringing movies I've ever seen. It's hard to watch at points because it's a film about self-discovery set in a period where I think most of us are developing who we are and who we want to be, and it's a very awkward time period for people to live in. Awkward interactions and knowing the desires and intentions of the main characters just makes you squirm in your seats. Elsie Fisher gives a standout performance, and honestly one of my favorite things about this film is not only almost all the child actors giving good and believable performances, but also they are cast age appropriate. Nothing gets under my skin more than watching a film trying to pass off mid-20 to 30-year-olds as high schoolers. Musically, the score feels very much Bo Burnham using his keys, but I was surprised Bo didn't do the score himself. The film is shot well, but the direction is another standout as well. It's competently made, and considering the age of most of the cast, it would take a strong director to get the performances he did out of these actors. The film also does a good job of showing the pressures that social media in a world online presents to children of that era. It's almost like a driving force for most of these kids in the film. The film presents these themes along with complex emotional swings of that age and the social constructs really well. My biggest complaints come down to simply the fact that it is so intentionally cringy that the film is kind of hard to stomach at some points. It's not one that I'm probably going to be reaching to watch again here soon, but even then, it's a really well made first feature that I can't wait to see what Bo does next as a feature film. Hell Comes to Frogtown takes place after a nuclear war where most of the male population was wiped out, and a race of mutant frog people have spawned. Roddy Rowdy Piper plays Sam Hellman, the hell that'll eventually come to Frogtown, when he is taken captured by a MedTech, a government agency that keeps him under lock and key because Piper's pipe is potent. They want to use him to impregnate a group of women being held prisoner by Commander Toddy, the evil frog. This is a movie I've wanted to see ever since I found out it even existed. I was hoping for something charming and campy, and that's pretty much what I got with Frogtown. First off, I love the environment and the world this story takes place in. I'm a huge fan of post-apocalypse style films. I love the vehicle designs, but most importantly, I adore the frog costumes and makeup. It's stiff, yes, but it's really well done and it's a lot of fun. Even the eyes move, it just adds a lot of charm. Piper is also a great lead in this film. Personally, I've always kind of liked Piper and leads in movies like this. I kind of wish he did more of them. And a few years later from this movie, he would go on to do the cult classic They Live. It's like he was made for this stuff. The rest of the performances are all decent, but the dialogue in the script is really bad, trying to fill most of the screen time with dialogue or exposition, and the story itself is rather predictable. Sure, there's a lot of charm, but there's also a good amount of downtime with failed attempts at humor. It's a shorter film coming in at 86 minutes, but you definitely feel it until the group finally arrives in Frogtown, where the pacing finally finds its footing. Musically, the score feels absent, or just so generic you don't remember it. It never really made itself a presence. From my understanding, the budget did get a $2 million slash, which I think with the extra cash, this film could have had a lot more going for it. There's good bones here. There just needed more behind it. Maybe for more elaborate action set pieces, or maybe some licensed music, probably would have went a long way to help this film out. I feel like the more I try to write about this film, I feel like I've pretty much said everything I have to say. It's one of those films that I wanted to like a lot more or wish there was a lot more to it, but unfortunately there's just not a whole lot to say. It is worth a recommendation just because of the costumes and Roddy Piper, and the overall story is fun, but I just wish there was more. Cinderella is a movie that's been on my watch list for a long time now. That poster / cover art is amazing. The film was put out by Tartan Asian Extreme, but the only thing really extreme about this film is how extremely boring it is. The film follows a young girl whose mother is a plastic surgeon. Her friends all want to get plastic surgery done for that never-ending quest of unnatural beauty, but weird, unexplainable things are starting to happen. As the plot builds and you get to reveal what's going on, you've probably checked out by that time. To say the plot is slow is an understatement in my opinion. I found there to be very little of anything going on in this movie. There's no tension or build for the horror scenes, the acting feels wooden, and the film has this late 90s, early 2000s horror look, which I know this is a 2006 film, but it looks awful. I don't care for that heavy green color palette that it plays with. Not saying that green can't be used to make something interesting, but in this film it felt less of a stylistic choice, but more because other films in the genre during that time period were using the same color scheme. I don't want to spoil the movies in the series, but I really didn't enjoy the plot reveal midway through the movie when you hear about the daughter's backstory. For me, it just felt like a cheap way to take the story, and I would have much preferred the story to stay more on a supernatural path. For scares or kills, I didn't really find any thrills. Most of the kills are dated looking CG or just not rememberable. The music feels very generic or feels like it's copying music from elsewhere. Where that elsewhere is, I'm not sure, but it does feel vaguely familiar. There's not a whole lot I enjoyed about this one. I mean, sure, it's not a train wreck of a film, the editing isn't bad, the cinematography is really not that bad, although I didn't like the color palette, but as for like terms of shot composition, it's serviceable. It just didn't do much of anything that made me invested or at least thrilled. I found myself rather just checked out and waiting to the end. You know, I'm rather disappointed with this one, not gonna lie. Strings was a random find at a half-price books, and the premise of the movie being made entirely out of marionette puppets is something I really haven't seen before.
America, fuck yeah! So lick my butt and suck on my balls, America, fuck yeah!
In all seriousness, I haven't seen one before set in something as serious as Strings is, or as intricate of a movie. The film follows Hal, played by James McAvoy, after his father is supposedly killed, and he is sent on a journey to bring his father's killers to justice and reclaim the throne. As far as the story goes, it's definitely something we've seen before, but the characters are well written, and there's some really fun scenes. Obviously, the standout feature in the film is puppeteering, and without a doubt, it is outstanding. The puppets look great, and the film goes all in on the fact they're puppets. This is a puppet world, no humans, and they use aspects of the marionettes as plot points. One character cuts his own headstring to commit suicide. They carve babies rather than give birth to them. They use old parts from the dead or prisoners to replace broken parts. But the puppeteering in this film is just outstanding. It's not like Team America where it's real cartoonish. This is done with all sincerity to create a grounded and realistic world that's set within this universe's parameters. I also like the fact the film isn't stop motion, because there's real world things like fire and water that really help bring the film to life. The sets and the puppet designs are beautiful, and the film is shot really well, creating some incredibly striking visuals, and it makes me sad to say that the DVD quality in this film is rather bad. Hopefully someone out there will do a restoration of this film on either Blu-ray or 4K, because it really does have a unique visual presence that I've never really seen before. The voice cast is all pretty great. I mean, James McAvoy is the lead. What more can you want? One thing I was surprised about was the fact that none of the puppets have mouths. I kind of thought maybe with wide shots it might be hard to tell who's talking, but the film does such a great job at not only the voice department in giving everybody noticeably different voices, but also manipulating the puppets enough to signal clearly who's talking without looking goofy. This is one I definitely recommend if it looks interesting to you, because it feels like a truly unique experience, even if the story is a little bit cliched. Buttboy is a movie my wife heard about from TikTok. She explained to me that it's a film about a detective searching for a missing kid who believes he have disappeared in his AA sponsor Chip's butt. With a premise like that, I was sold. Most of the movies on this list are ones that I bought and never got around to watching until this video, and that's not really the case with this one because I watched this one pretty much as soon as it came in. I'm including it into this series because people need to know about this film. I wish I had the audience that I could bring this to a much bigger crowd because this film is great. The story follows Chip as he found a new dependency of sticking things up his butt. Russell is a hard-boiled detective that's also an alcoholic. During an AA meeting, Chip becomes Russell's sponsor. It's funny that Chip is treating shoving things up his brown nose similar to, like, alcoholism. From here on out, Russell suspects Chip, and it becomes a cat-and-mouse thrilling chase ride. The thing I love the most about this movie is that while yes, this is a comedy, the film is played completely straight-faced. And because it's played so straight that it increases the humor tenfold. The film is directed by Tyler Cornack, who also plays Chip, and I would definitely want to check out whatever this dude does next. The film is really well put together, it's shot well, has some great color grading, the performances are all pretty great. Tyler Reitz as Russell is a real standout for sure in this film. He's absolutely fantastic. From small mannerisms to his hard-boiled attitude, he really develops the character on his own. The film also does a great job of building suspense. This film is a comedy for sure, but it also works really well as a suspense thriller mystery. It keeps you wondering how all this will play out, and it keeps you thoroughly engaged as the film proceeds toward the climactic punchline that literally made me bust out laughing. The absurdity is the real draw here, and it could be a major turnoff, but I love these kind of absurd concept movies, and this is definitely one of the better ones. This is one of those films that I've already recommended to most of my buddies, and one I really hope finds a cult following someday if it already hasn't. Apocalypto is a film directed by Mel Gibson that's always looked interesting to me, but I've just never went out of my way to try to find it. I think it was out of print at some point, I can't really remember, but a buddy of mine sold me his additional copy, so here I am. The film follows a Mayan clan that is raided by a much larger clan and taken captive. Many are killed, but the most are taken back as slaves or sacrifice victims. This is a brutal film to say the least. One of my favorite things about the film is just the setting. We don't really get very many films with tribes like this, and it's a cool and interesting setting. Now disclaimer, I know little to nothing about Mayan civilization other than the whole 2012 thing, so I'm just taking the film at face value. But at face value, it's pretty interesting. The makeup and the set design is definitely the star here. Everything from tattoos, piercings, gore effects, and the enemy tribe's leader looks amazing. Seriously, love this dude's getup. While there's a lot to enjoy here, the film never really felt as epic as the setup led me to believe it would be. When the tribe gets raided and are taken back to the other group's, basically city, it felt like a lead up to a large-scale revolt or something along those lines, but it just kind of turns into a one-man escape route kind of movie, which honestly felt like a bit of a letdown. Maybe on a second viewing, knowing what is going to happen, I won't be as disappointed, but it did make me feel a little disappointed on a first viewing. Another thing I personally didn't like of the film was some of the humor in the opening scenes. It just didn't land for me and just felt rather corny for the setting. I don't know, maybe it's pretty realistic to the culture, but I found it a little bit more cringy than I did funny. Other than that, I did enjoy Apocalypto quite a bit. Mel Gibson, despite your feelings about the madman, is as good of a director as he is an actor. He knows how to craft scenes for tension, action, and emotions, and Apocalypto is no exception. Scenes of tension are gripping and tense as they should be. You really care for the characters and hope they escape this awful predicament. You feel the connection between the tribes, and while I found the ending act to be disappointing, there's still some really gripping stuff here. Again, on a second viewing, my rating might go up. I highly doubt it would go down on a second viewing, but if you just go into this one expecting a little bit smaller scale of a story, even though it feels like it's going to build to an epic, you'll probably really enjoy it.
Who's gonna rule hell for the next 10,000 years?
Well, why do I need to go for? He's not gonna pick me.
I happen to think you'd make a great devil.
And I'm not into evil and torture and all that stuff. Plus, a prison doctor should have sort of a distinguished look to him, and let's fix that.
Feed the Light is a Swedish horror flick inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space. The film follows Sarah as she breaks into a facility and takes on a job as a cleaner to find her missing daughter that is somewhere inside. This facility though is bizarre, and the cleaners need to keep the sparkle cleaned up as it is dangerous. So basically it's like asbestos. The most standout thing for me in this movie by far is the visuals. This film has a very stunning visual style and plays with color really well. Most of the film is black and white besides blood via Sin City, and the daughter's red jacket reminiscent of Schindler's List. However, the film does become colored when Sarah ventures further into the facility, creating these otherworldly-like tones. I also really like the black and white segments. The whites are blown out while the blacks are mashed, creating a unique visual style that helps complement the idea of the film being based around light versus dark, or vice versa. Another thing I really enjoyed was the use of practical effects along with well-hidden CG moments. Most of the film is practical, but there are effects that are CG, and they use the color grading of the film to help blend the CG to make it look more believable. That could have otherwise looked really bad. Performance-wise, the lead Lena Sudin, who plays Sarah, was by far the best performance, where the rest of the cast was pretty okay. My biggest issue with the film would be the pacing. This is a 78-minute feature. Very short for sure, but it feels much longer because there's not really a lot going on. The premise of the film felt like it could have been told in maybe a 30 to 40 minute short film, rather than what it feels like stretching it out to be over 70 minutes. Sure, the ending is great and there are some solid moments, but there's these long exposition segments or just lingering shots that could have been trimmed. Sure, there's a lot of moments left open for interpretation, but for me there just isn't a lot of fat to chew on this film. You understand what's happening and then the minutes go by before the film finally moves on. Maybe on multiple watches there's a deeper meaning to dig for, but on the first time viewing, I feel satisfied enough to hold off my rewatch for a little while. This is a cool little horror flick with a very striking visual style that I'd definitely recommend checking out at least once for sure. Tag is a film by Shino Sono, a director who I've been becoming a big fan of, with movies like Why Don't You Play in Hell and Coldfish. So when I came across the UK Blu-ray at a used bookstore for cheap, I was pretty pumped having a region-free player and English subs. I was no real problem giving this one a watch, other than maybe actually watching the film. The film follows Mitsuko as her and her classmates are on a field trip. She drops her pen. As she bends over to pick it up, the bus gets sliced in half, killing everyone but her. From there, the mayhem ensues as she tries to make sense of what's going on, seeming to bounce from person to person, living different lives while this force is chasing her. It's a wacky idea that does lead down to some fun and rememberable moments, but my main issue with the film really comes down to that while the mystery of what's going on is there, the film doesn't really try to explain what's going on, and with the lack of character development in the film, I don't really care to figure out. I felt more or less like just waiting for the big set pieces. As for the set pieces, while they're fun, they look incredibly fake with terrible CGI. Very cut and paste muzzle flashes and blood effects. Sure, the concepts of the set pieces are fun, but the bad effects are definitely distracting. Speaking of distracting, they also use the Walking Dead theme song a bunch in this movie. The song is played out through most of these set pieces, and because it's so tied with The Walking Dead, I was just thinking about The Walking Dead rather than kind of thinking about the movie. Performance-wise, I think most of the cast did a pretty good job here. Nothing is really stand out, but nothing was really noticeably that bad either. I did really enjoy the school and wedding scenes. They definitely stuck out. And the opening cutting the bus in half is definitely a strong opener. I don't know, I guess I was just hoping for more, especially seeing some of the director's other works. This just felt rather generic, and his directorial style didn't really come through either. But by all means, this isn't a horrible movie either. It's just rather bland and forgettable. Maybe with some better effects it would have landed stronger, or maybe more character development. I guess I just wanted more than what I got. The Clowns, or I, Clowns, depending on what side of the box you look at, is an Italian film directed by Federico Fellini. The film follows a film group as they interview clowns about their art and follow around the circus. It blends mockumentary and documentary styles to tell the history of clowns and their art form, showcasing the stunt works, and the circus. This is a movie that is exactly perfect for someone out there. Someone out there will think The Clowns is one of the best films ever made, but for me, it just isn't for me. I always hate watching these kind of films because I understand the merit and how perfect this could be for someone, but for me, I just couldn't get into it. Clown humor just isn't really my humor. Sure, I love some good clownish slapstick, but some of the gags and the exaggerated performances just aren't really my thing. They've never led me to really have that much of an interest in clowns. Clearly, Fellini loves them because this is clearly a passion project. It's a deep dive into a more obscure art form that a lot of people don't have much of an appreciation for. And without a doubt, The Clowns does a great job at exploring these people and their craft to forge a new appreciation for it. Most of the film is broken down into two camps: film the circus as they perform the show, and the other parts are basically like interviews about the art or the history of clowning, some behind the scenes of the circus. For me, the circus segments were much more entertaining. I found myself losing interest in the interview or backstage portions and found it hard to keep my mind from wondering. Again, this feels like something that somebody who is interested in something like this would adore. One thing I really loved was the music. It's mostly classical Italian or classical circus style music, and I loved it considering it takes up a lot of the audio space in the film. I also really loved all the costumes and the makeup of the circus. It does a really great job of blending documentary and mockumentary styles that I'm not really sure what side of the fence it actually takes place on. Fellini even plays himself as the director in the film, so it goes pretty meta. It's a decent film that's well made for sure, but it just wasn't something for me.
Fortune from Zoltar. Men of genius are admired. Men of wealth are envied. Men of power are feared. But only men of character are trusted.
Terrence Malick is one of those directors I've always wanted to dive into since he's considered one of the greats, and besides Tree of Life, I haven't seen anything else by him. One day at Half Price Books I came across Knight of Cups and a buddy of mine told me that I should get it, and that for him it's a 10 out of 10. I wish it was for me as well. Knight of Cups follows Christian Bale's character Rick as he wandering about. Really, he's trying to find love, but that's really what happens in the film, is just wandering around. One scene, Bale is wandering around LA, and the next he's wandering around Las Vegas, and so forth. Malick definitely has an interesting visual style, very floaty and almost poetic in its visual aesthetic, which leads to serve some narrative, and it feels very much like a poem. But while poetic in nature, narratively, the film is very thin and stretched beyond what it should have been in my opinion. From the IMDb trivia, it said Malick shot the entire film without a script, and honestly, it kind of feels like it. Most of the film is B-roll with Christian Bale walking around looking at stuff. Most of the interactions between characters have dialogue muted while music plays over. It creates a rather unique feel to the film, and like I said, it feels very poetic, but it just doesn't offer much in terms of a compelling story or rich character development. It feels rather flat, and while I hate this saying, I can see most people saying that this is style over substance. I'm a firm believer that style can be substance, and in many cases like this, you need to look at the director's intentions. And honestly, I'm impressed that they were able to craft a film like this considering on how I'm assuming it was shot. Apparently the editing process took over 2 years to finish, and I'm sure it was not an easy edit. It's admirable to see something so uncompromising, and while I respect that aspect of the film, it doesn't always make for something enjoyable or something edible. Personally, for me, this is a film that if they trimmed out about 30 to 40 minutes of the B-roll, I could easily see myself giving it a 6 or a 7. But there was just so many scenes that felt like they added nothing to the point that I just found myself checking out, losing interest despite how visually interesting I found the style to be. Tokyo Story is one of those movies that's been on my watch list for a long time, and a Criterion release that I've wanted to pick up for a long time as well. This is one of the more recent entries into the archive, but still like over a year ago. This is a slice of life story about a couple venturing into Tokyo to visit their children. Their children see their visit as more of a burden than it is a pleasure, but as the couple stays, the children realize the importance of family, but it might be a bit too late. These slice of life movies can be rather hit or miss for me personally. Sometimes it's incredibly fascinating and can really strike home with me, and other times I can find it be rather boring. For me, Tokyo Story kind of sits somewhere in the middle. It's shot beautifully, the performances were strong, but for the story I just had a hard time finding any interest or connection with the characters, leading me to be rather bored with sections of the film. Sure, the ending is a great emotional climax that both presents a message and emotional response, but there's large sections of the film that I just found myself not focusing on the film, returning my focus to feel like I didn't really miss anything either. Maybe I just wasn't in the right mood or headspace for a film of this kind. That's why I'm always open to giving films a second viewing, and this will probably be one of them that I'll give a second viewing at some point down the future. There's a lot of elements on a technical scale that is really great. Using the camera at pretty much only low static shots creates some really striking imagery and composition. There's a strong sense of direction when it comes to the patience of the film, where you can really tell this is the film that the filmmakers had in mind making. It's kind of somewhat uncompromising. The character depth feels like it's there, and I enjoyed seeing a Japanese film from the 50s set in the modern time of that time, but there was something about it I just kept losing focus. Maybe in the future my thoughts will change with the second viewing, but for now I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10, just because I can see why people would call this a masterpiece. My rating could always change for the future, but I'm glad I finally get to cross this one off my list. Amir and Sam was a great Dollar Tree find. I'm starting to realize how many of these films are from the Dollar Tree, but finding a Draft House release for $1 will always be awesome. I'm not gonna lie when I say that in the Draft House line, Amira and Sam probably was not near the top. After watching it, however, how wrong was I? Amir and Sam is a realistic and heartfelt story about Sam returning as an Iraq veteran falling for an Iraq immigrant, Amira. As their relationship blossoms, Amira's legal troubles and facing deportation leads Sam to figure out just what to do. First off, this is a shorter film, barely under 90 minutes, and it just flies by. Sam and Amira are a blast to watch together on screen. They have great chemistry together on screen, and their relationship feels very honest. Sam is a well-written character with a lot of depth, and Martin Starr, who plays him, does a fantastic job. Seeing Sam transitioning back into civilian life and wanting to become a comic is a small story arc, but it's handled really well and very moving when you come to the end. Of course, Amira is also well written with a lot of depth. Dina Shahabi also does an amazing job bringing her to life as well. The acting all around is just pretty great here, despite, for at least me, not really seeing any familiar faces. The honesty is probably the best aspect of the film in my opinion. Nothing is really dramatized, it's a simple, straightforward look at an unlikely relationship, and just the everyday goings is what makes for the drama itself. Nothing is really played up here, and for me, that's what makes this movie so charming and moving. You only wish for the best and hope everything comes out great for them. In terms of visuals, the shot composition is pretty basic. It works for sure, but the color grading, I love. They use some rather basic and simple grading to create a more naturalistic slice of life look, and it complements the film very well. The editing and the score is also pretty great too. They all work together to bring in this atmosphere of it's just a slice of life really well. I love when this happens, when I find a film that I wouldn't really be that interested in the first place, decide to give it a watch, and then was kind of pleasantly surprised by it. I really enjoyed this one. A Night of Horror Nightmare Radio is a horror anthology based around a late-night radio show telling scary stories. It's a pretty simple and easy setup for an anthology. Anthologies to me are always interesting because you have a much larger pool of talent working on them to contribute different ideas, style, and direction. But much like most anthologies, some segments can be rather hit or miss. Night of Horror contains 8 short films and the overarching night radio show that ties everything together. My personal favorites would be the Coin Girl picture one, where the little girl needs to set up a dead girl's body to take a picture for the family. It's set in the old timey and she needs to make her look alive when things get spoopy. And I also really liked the Woman in the Woods one. I can't show too much of that one because the woman is naked, but it felt like a nice little survival story with a good twist at the end of it. The rest kind of feel like throwaways, and there's one that's like about a hairstylist that was done much better in the film The Stylist. There's several of these shorts that feel like they're kind of cut and paste from each other. To me, one of the best things about anthologies is a different creative input, and that doesn't really feel the case here. The entire film could have been directed by one director and you probably wouldn't even know the difference. A lot of the shorts also feel like they follow similar storylines or have similar scare moments as well. None of the shorts are really that outstanding. There are two that are pretty decent while the rest are pretty forgettable. The overarching radio show, while I like the premise, the lead actor gives probably the worst performance of the entire cast. This is another Dollar Tree find and most of the shorts feel like they were. This is definitely watchable though. It's not impossible to get through it by any means, and maybe you'd like some of the shorts more than I did. For me, there just wasn't anything that strong to stand out about this film as an experience as a whole. The Villainess is a Korean action film that probably has one of the best openers of all time. It's shot POV style and it gets the blood pumping and it hits hard. You can tell right out the gate that this is going to be a high octane action packed that holds no punch thrill ride, and it is, for the most part. The film follows Soo-ki after she goes on a murder spree wiping out an entire gang when she is captured and is indoctrinated as an assassin for an intelligence agency. First off, the main reason you're going to want to check this one out is for the action set pieces because they're amazing. If you're a fan of John Wick, you're at home here, and according to IMDb trivia, the motorcycle chase scene in this film heavily inspired John Wick Chapter 3's motorcycle chase scene. The action in this film is handled perfectly. It is heart-pounding, packs a punch, and the set pieces are all filmed and choreographed in a different way to not let you really feel fatigued while watching this, even if it feels like you're running a marathon just to keep up. It's bloody, impactful, and it's impossible not to watch the action. Visually, the film looks great, moving into the hyper-saturation color palette that I love, and fits the action set pieces really well. The camera is frantic and quick-moving with some really awesome transitions that keeps the pace of the film sharp and brisk. But where the film shines as an action flick, it falters kinda hard at a narrative point. The story is just too convoluted, filled with too many twists with little to no depth, and an editing style that just jumbles it further as a narrative piece. All the awesome editing during the action scenes is what makes the action of the Villainess stand out, but also is what makes the story feel rather incoherent. The story jumps around timelines and characters where the narrative aspects feel hollow and boring compared to the action, and without strong characters and depth, there is moments where tension in the action scenes feel a little lacking. While still heart-pounding and explosive, I could tell it could have just been so much more with stronger story and characters. This easily could have been one of the best action flicks ever made if the story was just much stronger here. This is still one I highly recommend because the action is handled so well. I just wish the story was better. King Cobra is a film that I've always seen the cover to but never really knew what it was about. I came across it at a flea market for $1, missing the DVD, but at least the Blu-ray was still there. I'm not gonna lie when I say I'm a sucker for this type of color scheme. I think we know this by now. Bright neon colors, heavy purple, blue, red, I love it. There's something so visually attracting about it, and I keep finding myself throughout the years buying films that use these colors in either the artwork or throughout the film. This one, though, is just mainly on the artwork. The film follows gay porn producer Steven, played by Christian Slater, as he discovers a new star. On the other end is Harlow, played by Keegan Allen, and Joe, played by James Franco, a competitive porn duo. Joe and Harlow want the new talent to work for them, and thus tension between the two companies grow until it turns deadly. Now let's get the elephant out of the room. I know nothing really about the true story whatsoever, but from the limited amount of reading I've done, the film, from what people have criticized, I took, had some massive liberties with the story. Also, the real life Brent Corrigan, the one everyone is fighting over, played by Garrett Clayton, has said he thinks the story was heinous and tells a story with contempt for queer culture and a mockery for porn. For someone who knows nothing about the true story while watching it, I did enjoy it as a film. Looking a little bit into the real story, I could see why people would be upset, and that is something to look at going into these films that are inspired by true stories. How does the film pay respects to the original source, or how does it disrespect? For me personally, I try to separate film from whatever it's attached to judge the film on its own. And for me, as someone who's not really well known with the true story that this is based around, it doesn't really bother me that much with the liberties it took. However, I have to agree that the film does feel like they have some contempt, or at least misguided judgment when it comes to the queer or pornographic culture. The film, to me, at least gives off the tone that it's shameful to be in pornography because the characters in the film are basically blackmailed, that if you don't suck dick, then I'm gonna tell your mom. I'm sure this is probably something that happens in real life, but the film plays it off in a very fictitious way. Not to mention that they basically portray porn actors and directors as basically sex addicts who just have sex with everyone all the time. And as for the queer culture in the film, it's kind of portrayed in a similar light. Pretty much all the 4 leads in the film have some kind of mental issue, and it's portrayed in a very flamboyant way, very stereotyped. With that all set aside, I did enjoy King Cobra. It's decent. Any film gets a bonus point for having one of my favorite bands, Scissor Sisters, in the soundtrack. But Christian Slater is very good here, and so is James Franco. Yes, James Franco sounds like a piece of shit as a human being, but he does got acting chops. The other 2 leads, Garrett Clayton and Keegan Allen, are both really good as well. The film, in terms of pacing, is very well paced, and it does just kind of fly by. It builds tension because the entire cast is excellent here. Visually, I'm sad to say there's not a bunch of neon colors and stuff like that like there is in the cover. It's rather straightforward in terms of visuals. There are also some audio issues where screaming was clipping. And a nitpick here, but they're playing Halo with PS2 controllers. That's constantly annoying, like when they do stuff like that. Nobody will notice. Well, I noticed every time. In the end, I did overall enjoy King Cobra. It's a film I went into with relatively not knowing anything about. Maybe that's what you should do as well. If you think that you may be offended by how they take liberties with the true story it's based on, maybe skip this one. But for me, it's a 6 out of 10. The Assassin is a Chinese film that deserves to be in this series because I bought it on release day back in 2015 when it came out and never watched it. I honestly don't have a good reason why. After watching it all these years, it's pretty good. The film follows an assassin sent to kill a political figure. When she fails, she is sent to kill someone else from her past, making her think about her life. It's a pretty simple story, but never really feels fully developed in terms of character depth. What is well developed is the beautiful cinematography. This might be one of the best shot films so far on this list, using black and white, grainy color, and changing aspect ratios to capture some truly stunning landscaping and outstanding wardrobe and set design pieces. There's some great shot composition, and it's one of those films that the visuals feel very layered that may need a few watches to truly see the depth on a visual side. And it kind of feels somewhat a Kurosawa-esque on a visual standpoint. However beautiful this film is, though, it's very, 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 very slow. Characters even feel like they move slow at most parts. The few in between action set pieces are fun and well choreographed, and they help break up the monotony of the slow dialogue scenes, but they are few and far between. I don't mind slow-paced films, but you need to build to something, which this film doesn't do very well. When you have these pretty solid set pieces scattered around, it makes these slow, long dialogue scenes seem even longer. There's not a very good rhythm to the pacing, which makes this hour 45 film feel much more like a 2.5-hour film. The score in the film is pretty great. I love these old traditional kind of scores in these Eastern period pieces. I really love the ending score that goes into the credit score. There's a lot of great elements to this film, but it just boils down to the story and pacing for me. I'm sure there's going to be some that won't have the same issues with this one as I did, so please judge for yourself. But if it wasn't for such strong visuals, sets, and wardrobe and score, I could have easily seen myself checking out of this one. Five Fingers from Marseille, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's what they call it in the film, is a South African film about 5 kids in the town of Marseille when police show up and extort money from the town. The kids lead a small revolt, which leads to Tao, the Lion of the Marseille, one of the 5 Fingers, killing 2 police officers, causing him to run away from town. Years later, Tao returns to Marseille to find his brother Zulu, another of the 5 Fingers, dead, and the rest scattered throughout the town as a vicious gang leader strikes for power over the town. This was probably one of the best blind buys from the Dollar Tree I've found in a long time, and unfortunately, the DVD is a rather bad pressing. The compression rate is just bad, but the film itself is a dark, brutal thriller with complex characters that grips you from the opening act and never lets go. Every actor brings their A-game to develop realistic and moving characters. We have a large time gap in between the ages of the characters, and it's quick to see how the characters have grown and developed in this absence. Tao is a man who's looking for redemption since his actions as a kid set off a chain reaction that has harmed the town and his friends. Pockets, the wealthy Finger, naturally became a politician, becoming the town's mayor and wanting to create a new Marseille as a wealthy and more prosperous town, but it's not all that it seems to be. Cockroach, another Finger, who was captured as a prisoner of war after the retaliation from the law from Tao's actions, has become the chief of Pocket's police force, but is rather unhinged. Leroto is now working with her father at a bar that he's ran since they were children in old Marseille. Pockets wants her to move into New Marseille so he can protect her from the rising gang lord, but she refuses. And the rest of the Fingers, Unati, the storyteller, who becomes a pastor and clings on to what was once, and Zulu, who's dead. There's a lot going on in this 2-hour runtime with a lot of characters, which makes this film just fly by. The film has a great sense of foreshadowing and uses it to kind of make the film feel like it comes full circle. This is the feature debut of director Michael Matthews, who went on to follow up this with Love and Monsters, another movie that I really enjoyed. So with that and this strong debut under his belt, he's definitely a director I'm going to be keeping my eye on. One thing I kept thinking about was just how brutal some of the violent set pieces were, and how well done the blood and gore effects are. Bullet holes continue to bleed, people don't really just fall over and die, but rather continue to fight, which leads to some very grounded and heart-pounding action scenes. Honestly, I went into this one with little expectations and was rather just floored by how good this actually was. My only real complaint would just be how rather cliche the score was, but outside of that, I would definitely recommend Five Fingers from Marseille. Garlic and gunpowder sounds an awful lot like a smelly version of gunpowder milkshake to me. I grabbed this one from the Dollar Tree as it looked like it might be a fun romp. I went into it with little to no expectations and still left rather disappointed. The film follows 2 mobsters who work under the boss Ma, which is one of the worst characters I've seen in a long time.
Roxy? Fuck you!
The 2 wander around making terrible joke after terrible joke as a comet is coming to supposedly destroy the Earth. The film follows this super unlikable cast as they try to prepare for the end or score a big deal. It's awful. The characters are annoying, the humor falls flat every time, there's a lot of terrible green screen and effects, the acting is awful, very characterized, the film looks incredibly cheap, and it's a massive slog to get through. This is the kind of film I hate to talk about because there's nothing really worth talking about. Everything is bad, and what isn't bad is below average to say the least. There's nothing I really liked about this one other than I'm happy I only paid $1 for it. This is probably the shortest video in the series, but there's nothing to say about this one other than I don't recommend it. Satan's School for Girls is one that I found at a little record shop in Gatlinburg, Tennessee called the Rhythm Section that has an amazing horror section. I'm not sponsored by them, but I would love to be. But it's just a place I found years ago, and every time I'm in the area, I always go there. From the great box art to the $10 price sticker and the fact that the title sounds exactly like an Electric Wizard song, it piqued my interest. Satan's School for Girls follows a young woman who joins a private school for girls after her sister kills herself. But the school isn't all that it seems to be. It's actually a cult.
What a twist!
Now this is exactly the atmosphere of an Electric Wizard song. It's grainy, very 70s, and the last 5 minutes is very culty. But this film really lacks the blood and boobs you'd expect from a film like this. Normally films like this make up for the lack of acting and their low budget with some gory moments and a lot of boobies. But this film substitutes the titillation for actually some good acting and some decent cinematography. It was kind of one of the most surprising aspects of the film. Neither the acting or the cinematography is groundbreaking, but for a film in this genre or niche, it's better than the usual fanfare. This film is a brisk 78 minutes, which I'm glad for because about 65 of those minutes is basically exposition or just dialogue interactions between classmates or their teachers' discussions. The nitty-gritty part of the film isn't until like the last 5 or 10 minutes of the film, and there's not a lot happening up to that point. But since the film is so short and most of the aspects of the film is rather solid, it's not really hard to get you to that semi-lackluster conclusion. There's a lot with Satan's School for Girls I wish was better. More cult, more kills, more boobs, but it's not a bad little 70s grindhouse style flick either. However, due to the plot, I can't help but think Suspiria is just a much better version of this film. Just saying this though, Satan's School for Girls came out in 73 while Suspiria came out in 77, so who's copying whose homework there, Mr. Argento? 13 Assassins is director Takashi Miike's remake of the 1963 film of the same name. Miike is one of my favorite directors of all time. Over 100 films in his catalog, and while I've only seen maybe a quarter of his films so far, each of them varying, there's always a shine of his style that peers through, coloring each film charming despite if it not always lands for me. It's this aspect, along with making some truly great masterpieces, that has probably put him comfortably in my top 5 of all time directors. If you know of Miike's films, a lot of them have this pulpy-like feeling to them, balancing in some goofiness and levity that 13 Assassins is completely void of. This feels like one of Miike's most mature outings. It is brutal. It's a brutal film following a group of assassins banding together to try and stop a ruthless, violent, and sadistic lord from gaining even more political power. The mission feels like an outright suicide mission from the start, and that tone bears heavy throughout the film. From brutally blunt sadistic moments caused by the Lord that would make even hardened Miike fans cringe at, to the war against the Lord where the 13 face off what seems to be a never-ending army, this is a bleak film with extreme violent moments. The film is a slow build for the first hour or so, but then the back half of the film is just filled with great samurai sword fighting, some brutal kills and gore that's just impossible to look away, even if you feel like you can't stomach it. Miike handles the action sequences so well and for so long, it's hard not to call him a master at his craft. The action in this film is simply riveting. The sword fighting feels realistic in the film in the sense where they don't get stabbed or sliced or just fall down for the most part, but they fight until their bodies just give out. The Lord is truly a menacing villain in the film because his level of torture he is willing to inflict is just through the roof. You root for his demise, and while the samurai are duking it out, you're hoping for them to finally reach that Lord. It'll put you on the edge of your seat while also being shot really well. The film looks amazing. I love the sound design because they went with a much older take on the sword noises and stabbing sound effects, which makes the film feel timeless. The special effects are really well done here, as well as the hair, makeup, and wardrobe. There's just so many scenes that are just feel so brutal in this film you can't look away. Miike for me has a long history of having somewhat of a chaotic energy to his films, from the way the characters act, to the way the camera moves, to how the film is edited, or even how wacky the stories end up getting. 13 Assassins doesn't have that in the same sense, but it does build this chaotic energy that feels very much like a Miike film by the action toward the end of the film. The fight sequences builds this kind of frantic energy of Miike, but also has some rather still camera work. 13 Assassins is a perfect movie to introduce people into Miike's work. And for an Eastern Samurai film, while it is brutal as it is, it's a masterpiece that is an essential viewing of the genre. Animal Kingdom is a film that's always been on my watch list because David Michôd has put out some really amazing stuff, not to mention the cast involved. I was pretty sure going into this one that it would be good, and I was right. This is an Australian crime thriller about a teenager named Josh, played by James Frencheville. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, I apologize, growing up in a criminal family, as the family starts to be broken down from pressure of the law and their own internal problems. The entire cast gives great performances here, but again, I'd expect no less from Jackie Weaver, Joel Edgerton, Guy Pearce, and Ben Mendelsohn. The film is well shot, and the film does build some really intense scenes with great characters. All the main characters feel well developed, but my issue just comes from some of the moments that feel like they go nowhere. And for some reason, I honestly can't pinpoint why, but I just found myself losing interest in the film towards the last act. Like I said, I can't pinpoint it because everything in this film is exactly the kind of movie I love. Maybe it was the police aspect of the film, I'm not sure, but I just found myself getting bored and distracted at nothing while watching it. Maybe this is one I should rewatch. Maybe I just wasn't in the right headspace for a movie when I watched it. Everything here is things I love in film. Well shot, great characters, a cast I love, a crime drama thriller with a crime family being the central head, great moments of character tension, and some shocking moments of violence. But yet, around the hour 10 mark, I was just completely losing focus. My mind was wandering and I just felt like I could feel the runtime. Maybe it's a pacing issue. It's weird because normally I can pinpoint my problem I have with a film. Normally I can give it a day or so, let it sink in and figure it out. But to be honest, it's been a couple days since I've sat down and watched this one, and I still don't really know what my issue with this film is. I'm definitely going to have to rewatch this one when I get some free time. I don't want me saying this to dissuade you from giving it a shot if you haven't watched it yet. There's a lot to love and appreciate about this film. Even if I found myself in the situation I was with this one, I can still see and appreciate what this film is offering. For now, I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. On a second viewing, it could be much higher, but I'm going to stick with a 7 out of 10 on the first viewing. Sunshine is a good example of, even though I really wanted to see it, I still put it off forever after buying it. Danny Boyle is a pretty established director with movies like 28 Days Later, 127 Hours, and my personal favorite of his, Trainspotting. The film is also written by Alex Garland, who is a great sci-fi writer and director as well, and boasting a large and talented cast with the likes of Cillian Murphy, Chris Evans, Rose Byrne, and Mark Strong, to name a few. This was a film that I've always listened to the score of. John Murphy is probably in my top 5 favorite film composers, and the score from this film is pretty well known and used in other films. So for years of listening to the film score, I finally got around to buying Sunshine when I found it at a Blu-ray bin at Best Buy. Well, now, much later, I have finally watched it and I really enjoyed it. First off, the amount of talent in this film really shines through, because there's a lot of amazing aspects of the film. The entire cast give great performances, this is a visual feast, and the score is amazing. Beautiful landscaping shots of space, amazing effects for the sun. I love the shuttle design and the spacesuits, and there's some really cool visuals with showing faces in the suits and how they use some of the overlays. The lighting and grading along with the shot composition is all top notch as well. Honestly, this is a masterpiece of visuals, 10 out of 10 on visual sides. Like I said before, the score is outstanding as well. It really impacts the film. It enhances every scene that it's in. Something I've noticed when I rewatched 28 Days Later was that the ending score that has become kind of synonymous with the film is actually a lot more epic and grandiose than the scene it's actually playing in. And I don't feel that way with Sunshine because the film feels epic and large, just like the score. I was completely glued for the first hour and 10 because it's such a great intense setup. A group of astronauts head into space to detonate a bomb to reignite the dying sun. The first Icarus crew has went missing, and on their way to deliver the payload, the crew gets a distress signal from the OG Icarus. After a coursing accident, the damaged ship tries to salvage what they need from Icarus 1 and to see what happened to the crew, which is thrilling and exciting. The last 30 minutes, however, takes a slight turn, and I personally really don't like the direction they went with it. No spoilers, but it feels very unnecessary and cheap. The film itself built such great tension and characters that I was on the edge of my seat just hoping for them to pull through this dangerous situation they found themselves in. Then the film kind of throws a monkey wrench in and it just felt cheap. It really took me out of the experience, and for me, while not completely ruining the film, definitely lessened the film for sure. But on another positive note, I really love the editing. The film puts a lot of flash cuts with images throughout the film to create jarring moments to feed the mental distortion of the crew. It was great. Overall, I really enjoyed this one, and I can easily see myself watching it again sometime soon. I just really enjoy these full-on sci-fi films and would definitely recommend this one if you haven't seen it before. Metropolis is a film that's always been on my watch list for a visual reason. There is no denying that the artwork and the image of the robot is iconic and very striking for a film from 1927. But since this is a 2.5-hour silent film, it's been a little intimidating to sit down and watch. Silent films are a hard set of films to jump into, at least from my waning attention span. So normally I've stuck with the comedies from the era, Charlie Chaplin and so forth. However, after watching Metropolis, it really opened me up to the idea of checking out more from this era. Metropolis is a hard sci-fi dystopian film about an underground city of workers working for a man to keep the city above working. The man's son sees a woman and it's love at first sight. His son ventures down to the underground city to find the woman, and his father goes looking for him. That's a pretty lame description of the film, but if you haven't seen it, there's a lot more to it than that. I just don't want to give away very much of what's going on. I don't really want to describe the film for people who haven't seen it, since not a lot of people normally watch old silent films nowadays. This is one I think you kind of want to go into not knowing that much about the story. I think you'll be more engaged. The way the story unfolds and the characters within, their motivations and actions is really what kept me into the story as much as I was. To see a film that uses no dialogue other than dialogue cards, it was surprising to me to see so much character depth and development. To see a narrative that is so engaging without saying anything, I was surprised to see myself enjoying it as much as I was. Visually, the film is a masterpiece. There are so many great shots, amazing sets, and some really striking visual effects, especially for the time. The costumes and the makeup was all great, and honestly the film just felt so ahead of its time. One thing I've always liked about looking back at old films like this is to see the culture and the time of the film. And sci-fi movies are always very interesting to me because they kind of have to guess what the future may be like. But Metropolis feels truly timeless. It carves its own path, not to really feel futuristic, but rather a society that felt organic to its own story. Now with that all being said, it is still a 2.5-hour silent movie. That runtime in any movie requires some patience, and while the film does a lot of great things, it is still a silent film that's hard to get adjusted to at first. I feel like once you get into the first 40 minutes or so, you can kind of get into the groove, and if you're more familiar with silent films, then you've probably already seen this one. I really watched the 1927's Metropolis so I could finally watch the animated Metropolis based on Osamu Tezuka's manga, which I was under the assumption was based off of the old silent German film, but reading some trivia on the IMDb's, it says the film was actually inspired by the poster, not the actual film itself. Apparently Tezuka never watched the film, which I call horseshit because there's a ton of parallels. Where the old film is about classism and an aristocrat goes among the poor people and falls in love with a woman who's the face of a rebellion, this is more of a noir, futuristic chosen one kind of story. The parallels are the class systems and the structure of how the worlds work, more than the main plot beats, if that makes sense. But you could also pinpoint a lot of characters in this film to be inspired or based off of the characters in the 1927 film. Both films feature a multi-layered city where the lower levels are the power of the city above, a barren type going for political power, a new fantastical machine, and a lower class looked down upon. In the animated film, instead of the lower class being the people who work in the city, they're robots. The 2001 animated film follows a detective and his nephew coming to Metropolis to find a doctor who's been known to be a black market organ trader. Along their way, they team up with a robot detective when the doctor's lab catches fire. Inside the lab, the detective's nephew, Kenichi, finds Tima, and they get separated from the detective and the robot. Tima and Kenichi must meet back up with the detective and the robot, but Tima has a secret that's coming for her. It's a really solid narrative, and honestly, a lot more quick pace compared to the silent film. Visually, this movie is stunning, and the animation is absolutely beautiful and striking. From the world design to Tezuka's cherub-like characters and artwork, mixing 2D elements and 3D elements, and just the vivid array of the color palette makes this one stand out as a masterpiece in animation. I also really loved the jazzy score to the film that fits this film really well. There's a lot to love here on a presentation level, that's for sure. I'm sure that this one being a talkie and not a silent film made me more engaged with the narrative side of the film than the 1927 one, but as a narrative, I did really enjoy the structure of this film more. Maybe it's because of the presentation makes it more engaging, but I really enjoyed the characters. Rock was a good villain, he felt very unpredictable. Tima and Kenichi's bond was fun to watch grow, and the detective and the robot was also fun to watch to run around this giant massive tech city. I've been putting off watching this one for years now, so I could watch the original first, which honestly, I didn't really even need to. Sure, I found some things to appreciate in this film since I did watch the original beforehand, but it's not necessary to watch this one after the 1927 film. You can watch this one on your own. However, I would say that both films are kind of unnecessary to watch, and I really enjoyed both of them. Personally, I enjoyed the animated film more. Tezuka's story I found to be, at least for me, more engaging than the original, but both are kind of, in my opinion, essential sci-fi viewings. They're awesome. Just check these ones out. The Passing is a film a friend of mine gave me for my birthday. It was a birthday present for my birthday. It was put out by Vinegar Syndrome, which is a label that, while they do great work on their releases, they give really great restorations, really good box art, and a bunch of bonus features, has a lot of releases that I wouldn't normally be that interested in. But the premise in the box art does pique my curiosity with The Passing. After watching it, I'm not really sure what this film is about. The film follows two old people as they're being old when one of them gets a body transfusion and returns unrecognizable. which is the plot summary. However, there's large chunks of the film with this random like killer guy in jail, and there's a little backstory about him, which I'm not sure why it's there. Honestly, it feels like it's from a completely different movie. Maybe I just didn't soak in the film enough. I found myself wondering quite a bit in this one. The old guys were the best part of the movie for me, for sure. I just enjoyed watching their interactions and mannerisms. And then we would just cut out of nowhere to this random dude, and it just felt like a completely different movie. Only the film grain and coloring would even make you think they're from the same film. The film does loosely tie the two stories together toward the third act, but it's a pretty loose tie in my opinion. Or I guess in the sense of a tie, it's more or less just two paths meeting that the both leading up stories don't really matter. There's a good bit here I did like. For one, I love the old computer graphics style for the opening credits and ending credits. I really enjoyed some of the editing too. One scene that comes to mind was this countdown, and I thought the editing effects to jump in on every second while also slowly zooming was pretty sweet. I also really love the lo-fi heavy grain with a lot of bluish tint for the visuals. Also, the choice of music and sound effects are like candy to your ears if you're a fan of these like 80s sci-fi films. It's just something about the sound design of that era I just love. Performance wise, there's definitely some really stiff performances. I haven't looked into it, but I'm assuming most of the actors are probably non-actors or amateur actors. The two old men for the leads though were great. Like I said, their screen time together were probably my favorite parts of the movie. While there are some cool visuals and decent ideas here, I don't think this one will linger very long in my brain juice. Alexandre Aja is a director I didn't really know I liked as much as I did until I realized I own a bunch of his stuff and have enjoyed almost all of them. He's a director whose style doesn't really stand out super strong as his own individual style, as much as just rather being a solid director with a good amount of films that are a lot of fun. High Tension being one of them that has always been on my list to watch before I even knew Aja was behind it. High Tension has a slight reputation for being part of the new extreme French wave of films along with films of Gaspar Noé, and it's a film that's popped up on a lot of disturbing movies lists over the years. Knowing Aja is behind the direction of the film made me really want to visit this one, but much like all the other films in the series, I bought it and thus it aged on a shelf. Finally sitting down to watch it, I have to say I was rather disappointed with this one. Now, I didn't go into this expecting a masterpiece, as these extreme movies rarely are in my opinion, but what I did get left me feeling a little frustrated despite having fun for the most part with it. High Tension is a brutal film with cartoonish violence that is hyper-saturated and some decent visual flair, but the standout is the gore effects. They look pretty great here. Also, the performances from the entire cast does honestly a pretty great job. The film follows Maria and Alexa as they head to Alexa's parents' house when a killer shows up, torturing the family along the way as Maria tries to save Alexa. It's a pretty simple concept that opens up for some really gory moments, but the film never really felt like it had much tension to me. I found the violence to be way too cartoonish to really be taken serious. So this is kind of much more of a grindhouse gore pick rather than a truly intense thriller horror. Also, when like the killer shows up to the house, it's super loud, and apparently nobody in the house can hear what's going on. It just kind of took the serious tension the film may have been trying to build away from me. It just felt goofy. The real problem though with High Tension is the awful, and I mean awful, plot twist at the end of the film. It completely ruins the film. The entire film does not work now. It actually breaks the movie apart in terms of a narrative. Literally, nothing in the movie makes any plausible sense after the plot twist. There's a few moments earlier on that I was thinking to myself, are they insinuating this? And when they actually did it, I completely checked out of the movie. It opens up so many massive plot holes, so many questions on how the events of the film would have even taken place, which crumbles the entire narrative structure of the film. It's a plot twist that feels so crammed in there that was so completely unnecessary. They could have just played the film straight and it would have been so much better. But because they forced this plot twist, it really tainted the film for me. Terry Gilliam has always been one of those directors that I've pretty much enjoyed pretty much everything he's done that I've seen, but I haven't really checked out a ton of his films. Brazilian, one of his films that's always been on my watch list because it's a dystopian set film, which is a setting I love for a narrative story. Brazil follows Sam Lowry, played by Jonathan Pryce, as he works in his bureaucratic building when he is offered a new job. His day-to-day life is busy and chaotic for him, but he's not really wanting to take the new job since he's somewhat comfortable at his old gig. At night, Sam dreams of flying literally free away from everything and flies to this woman in his dreams. One day, he runs into the woman of his dreams in real life and drastically begins to change. One thing I adore about this film is the dystopian setting. It's a very government-controlled, military-heavy-esque city, and in the background, there's a series of terroristic attacks that's disrupting life. The norms of life are just really interesting as well. They have wires and ductwork everywhere, they eat globs of colored mush for food, and the interactions between people just always feel strange. Visually, this movie is stunning. I love everything about this film visually. From the outstanding set design, world building, and great lighting, you get some really striking visuals. They use the visuals to emphasize the tone and magnifying the story using the visuals as a metaphor or literal meanings. It's beautiful and without a doubt one of the main reasons I really recommend this film. The film is also filled with a ton of great performances as well. Even Robert De Niro shows up for a minute. But I do have a few complaints or nitpicks, if you will. One thing was the audio. I'm not sure if it was the setup I was watching it on, but the dialogue in the film is very, very, very quiet. While the noise in the film, i.e. the explosions and gunfire and computer effects and machinery, are outlandishly loud. Now that might work in the sense of a sound direction because, you know, people interactions are just being drowned out by this machinery and warfare and everything like that of the surrounding world. But as someone trying to watch it on TV, it's kind of annoying to kind of sit and throttle the volume here and there, rocking that volume control back and forth to try to get kind of an even sound. Again, I'm not sure if running it through a different system like something with surround sound, it may sound different. Also, I wasn't really a fan of the ending of the film. I don't want to spoil the film, even though it's from the 80s, you've had plenty of time by now to watch it, but I won't spoil it. For me, the ending just left me feeling empty. It might have been the director's intention, but I felt like it built for really good closure, and you never get it. The ending just kind of made me feel like the film was somewhat pointless, or at least the last 30 minutes or so. Regardless though, I still really enjoyed this one and would definitely want to watch it again, and would definitely recommend it to you as well. Silk is a Taiwan horror film put out by Tartan Asian Extreme, a line that anytime I see them for under $5, I'll probably just grab whatever it is. And this was one of them I found at Big Lots for $3, and the striking box art just really struck me. After watching it, it's okay. The film is about a detective who specializes in reading lips who joins a team studying paranormal ghosts. The head of the team has created a meager sponge that captures spiritual energy, but when the government wants to shut down the team, the head of the team, Hashimoto, goes crazy and the detective must hunt him down. For one, the film has solid performances, music, and visuals with some generally good ideas, but it's pretty standard fanfare. It's nothing amazing. The film, though, just never really gripped me. I mean, just moments after watching it, I'm writing this and I'm having a hard time looking back on the film and really remembering very much of it. It has a strong early 2000s Asian horror look, which is a style that I kind of enjoy. It really depends on the movie, but these elements of a paranormal and a detective story and sci-fi elements just didn't blend well, as none of these elements really excelled on their own. A lot of moments in the film just felt like a checklist of things to do. Scare ghosts, check. Tension between the group, check. Emotional scene towards the end with very little build-up, check. One thing I did like was the ghost effects. Sure, they don't hold up the best to nowadays standards, but they are fun, there's no doubt about that. I just couldn't get into this one though. I know I've said it before in the past, hell I've even said in this series, but films like this are ones I really hate to cover. Doing a series like this, it's hard to avoid these because I go into these without watching them beforehand, but there's just nothing to really talk about with this. I mean, like I said, I'm already having trouble remembering this one while writing it, so that should just kind of say how much of an impact it had on me. Ah, finally, the last film of this series, going out with none other than an Akira Kurosawa film. One of my all-time favorite directors and someone that I will eventually watch all of his films. Mark my words. Kagemusha can now be checked off that list. Every Criterion sale I go out of my way to make sure I come home with like at least one Kurosawa film that I haven't seen before. Kagemusha was 1 or 2 sales ago, I can't really remember at this point, but Kurosawa is a master at his craft and revolutionarily ahead of his time. Films like Seven Samurai, The Hidden Fortress, and Ikiru have rippled throughout film history, inspiring many films and directors we love today. His films tend to feel timeless and classic at the same time. Kagemusha is no different. The film follows a thief who looks an awful lot like the Lord of the Clan, so he's hired to be a body double for the Lord. But when the Lord dies, the thief takes over the role of the Lord, while a whole council he's just a figurehead, he's just like a face for this council. The thief must follow into his role without being found out, and for a 3-hour film, this one flies by. The characters and the premise of the story is just so excellent. Everything is just so well developed in the 3-hour runtime. Visually, as always with Kurosawa, it's just stunning. A lot of a Kurosawa I've seen is normally in black and white, and I've not seen very much of his stuff in color yet, but he uses the color so brilliantly to give some truly striking imagery and a vibrant array of wardrobe. It's just gorgeous. His films are some of my favorite shot in terms of visuals. That's why I love him so much. There's one weird thing though I did notice. There's a random jump cut for seemingly no reason. I don't know if this was an issue with the Criterion release or just some random spot in the film. I don't recall seeing any other jump cuts in the film, so I'm just pointing this out. It's something that did take me out of the experience. Another thing I noticed was the sound design. Personally, I thought the sound design was rather bad in this one. There was moments large groups of soldiers would be marching, but they made no sound for dialogue to come through. The guns used in the film felt like they had 3 stock gun sound effects, and they just reused them over and over and over and over again. There was also many times in the film that I felt like the Foley just wasn't even there. Normally use Foley to develop the world, to make the world feel lived in, and just wasn't the case here. Things that should have made a noise just didn't. To see how carefully crafted a lot of this film was, and the films of Kurosawa I've seen, this was just strange to see such a lack in sound direction. It's definitely not something that ruins the film because all the dialogue does come through clear and good, but it's something I noticed and it kept bringing me out of the experience. Still, with Kagemusha, Kurosawa proves he is a master even in the later stages of his career. This one to me is an 8.5 out of 10. So I figured since we made it through 31 movies in 31 days, I would pick the top 5 of my list. Not going into much detail over them, just watch their individual videos instead. But it was actually really hard to pick only 5. There were a lot of films I watched in this series that I really enjoyed and would really recommend, but I had to narrow down a top 5, so this would be my top 5. Number 5, Metropolis 2001. Number 4, Butt Boy. Number 3, Kagemusha. Number 2, Riders of Justice, and number 1, drumroll please, 13 Assassins. This was just a really fun series to make, and I might make this into maybe a yearly thing, who knows. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. I hope I may have introduced you to some movies that you're willing to check out and may end up loving. I just had a great time with this. Have a good one. Peace.